Hi, everyone. Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us today. We're so excited to be here with you to share this important information. We very much appreciate you being here. My name is Lisa Davis. I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Advocacy at the Children's Partnership, and I welcome you here today. I'm going to start off with a few instructions and announcements, and then we can begin the presentation. To start, though, we do have an interpretation feature and Spanish interpretation available today. And so I'm going to start with that, and I will pass it over to Edna, who will give those instructions.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. This is Edna Santizo, and I'm going to be providing instructions on how to access interpretation. I'll do that first in Spanish, and then I'll follow in English. Hola a todos y todas. Buenas tardes. Soy Edna Santizo y voy a estar interpretando esta sesión junto con mi colega Julie Young. En un segundito van a ver en la parte baja de su pantalla, si está en una computadora, que va a aparecer un icono que dice interpretación. Una vez que aparezca, por favor presione y seleccione el idioma de su preferencia, ya sea inglés o español, y también ponga mute original audio o silenciar el audio original. Si está en un teléfono o una tableta, va a haber 3 puntos donde dice más o more. Presione, seleccione language interpretation, el idioma de su preferencia, y también mute original audio. Si por cualquier motivo tiene problemas con esa función, siempre puede regresar y seleccionar Unmute Original Audio. Y si tiene cualquier problema técnico, puede dirigirse al personal de TCP a través del chat. Gracias. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm going to be interpreting this session together with my colleague, Julie Young. In just a second, you're going to see an icon appear at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer that says interpretation. Once the icon appears, please click and select the language of your preference, either English or Spanish, and also mute the original audio. If you're on a mobile device or a tablet, you're going to see 3 dots where it says more. Click, select language interpretation, the language of your preference, and then mute original audio. If for any reasons you're having issues with this function, you can always go back and unmute the original audio. And if you need technical assistance, please reach out to the TCP staff through the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edna. Muchas gracias. Okay, so we're going to turn on the interpretation feature. Vamos a aprender interpretación. Okay, so now we'll give you about a minute to select your language. So underneath, you should see a globe that says interpretation. Deberían de ver un globo que dice interpretación y seleccione su idioma. Please select your language. Again, just a reminder, we just turned on the interpretation feature. Whether you want to listen in English or in Spanish, everyone does need to go down to the interpretation globe in the menu bar on the bottom of your Zoom and select either English or Spanish. This includes presenters as well. Next slide, please. Just a few announcements before we get started. So we are recording this webinar and the recording will be provided to you. We usually send out a follow-up email with a link to the slides, with a link to the recording in Spanish and in English, and then all of the resources. And you should be receiving that before the end of next week. For questions and answers, this is going to be more of a discussion style. And so once you start, we start the discussion with the Hope and Heal Fund. Everyone is welcome to unmute, raise your hand, be a part of the discussion. However, we do also have a Q&A feature. So if you want to use that feature, you could just go to where it says Q&A in the Zoom Q&A box. And there you will have the option to put in your questions if you prefer to submit questions in writing. For closed captioning, you click the live transcript button from the in-meeting Zoom toolbar and select one of the options from the menu. And lastly, just wanting to share that the Children's Partnership is inclusive of all people and perspectives, except for hate. We do not tolerate malicious comments and will remove and report anyone who feels the need to disrupt the growth and peace of the space. Our objective is to hold a webinar where all people are safe and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Next slide, please. I think one of the last things, let me cover the agenda first. So we're going to do some introductions where I also will very enthusiastically invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. But today, really, the main focus is a discussion around school safety as it relates to gun violence. And so our partners from the Hope and Heal Fund are here to have a discussion where they will include information around gun violence, important data, have a discussion with you around what community members can do, and then also provide policy updates around gun violence in California. Again, the questions are actually going to be throughout the discussion, and so feel free to raise your hand and or comment freely during our discussion. And at the very end, we are going to be sharing some closing remarks, some other education opportunities, and then also sharing our evaluation form where we're going to hold the raffle, and 3 attendees will win $50 for through a raffle. And so more information about that at the end. Next slide, please. So before I pass it over to the Hope and Heal Fund, I just invite you to please introduce yourself. We would love to hear your name, where you're from, what region of California you're in, if you want to share your city. If you work for an organization, would love to know which organization you work for. Yes, so please go ahead and feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know that you're here. We are also, I introduced myself earlier, but again, my name is Lisa Davis. Joining us from the Hope and Heal Fund today is Refugio Cuco Rodriguez and then Saul Serrano, both from the Hope and Heal Fund. And towards the end, you'll hear also from Ebony Durham, who is our Community Engagement and Advocacy Associate at the Children's Partnership. Again, we welcome you. And next slide, please. I believe now we're going to transition to the Hope and Heal Fund. Take it away, Cuco.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for allowing us to be here with you to talk about a little bit of our work, but also as it relates to school safety. And again, our conversation today, as we go through this, if people have questions, please feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself or put a question in the chat if you want, however you feel comfortable. As we kind of go along, I'll be presenting some information about our organization, but also some information related to school safety, in particular to gun violence. That is our focus. So maybe if we want to go to the next slide, and then we'll start a little bit of an overview of our organization. Next slide, please. Again, the mission of our organization really is to work with individuals and communities, government systems, philanthropy, and other folks and communities throughout California, really to create kind of a safe and free community from gun, death, injury, and trauma. Next, please. Our work in our fund was created after the unfortunate incident in San Bernardino, a shooting that occurred in 2016. And our fund was created by several foundations in the state of California that realized that not a lot of work was being done in the area of gun violence beyond just policy. So we don't do policy work. We don't advocate whether or not people should own guns or not own guns. What we do advocate is for safety and again acknowledge that gun violence is preventable in the forms of suicides and the forms of homicides as well. Those are the two areas. And a lot of our work really focuses on reducing gun violence and where it intersects in terms of equity, making sure that all communities and loss of life in all communities is addressed equally, because I think that there's significant disparities that we see. And the last part is that we also work with systems. We work with school systems, mental health systems, emergency ERs. We work with counties. We work with cities. That's a big area of focus for us. And we try to work with different organizations to try to help them kind of begin to develop strategies, and also with communities to help them understand the impact of gun violence in their communities and how to kind of address the impact of that. Next slide, please. This part's important because I think that for us, it's really important when we talk to communities or we talk to systems that people understand that gun violence is composed of a lot of different factors. And in order for us to appropriately address gun violence in our communities, we really need to look at strategies that look at prevention. That would be with young kids, but also prevention in terms of access, right? And we'll be talking a little bit about that after this I'm done with these, particularly in terms of schools and in the home. Intervention, again, what strategies we develop in communities after somebody has been shot or somebody has attempted a suicide. And so the intervention is a big part of it. And then aftercare. After somebody is killed with a firearm, either in the form of a homicide or a suicide, what types of services are afforded to the families or to the communities? Without those things, I think it becomes very difficult for us to appropriately address the issue and the impact of gun violence in communities. We also ask communities to consider a couple of other factors that are really important. One is gun proliferation. So how do guns get into the hands of people that probably shouldn't have guns? In some communities, when we look at the issue of suicides, of homicides, for example, it is looking at how law enforcement and how communities are tracking where these guns are coming from. We work in many communities where there isn't a gun store within like 150 miles, and yet they have plenty of guns that are accessible to young people who should not have access to them. So how are these guns getting into these communities? And so how guns get to places and how they're trafficked in many cases is a really important part of it, because sometimes communities are impacted by gun sales or other things that are going on in other communities. And the analogy that I use is, when I was growing up in my community, as a young person, if I wanted to purchase alcohol and I was a minor, nobody in my community sold alcohol to minors. But in neighboring communities, I knew stores that I could go and I could purchase alcohol, and they only sold alcohol to minors. And I think guns, should be viewed that way as well. In many communities, we have people that are pretty rigid about following the laws. And then there's other communities where what we see is gun sales that are kind of loose. Some of the data that we have right now is that one of our partners, Brady United, is pulling together, indicates that in 90% of the cases where a gun was involved in criminal activity, only 5% of gun stores are responsible for 90% of those sales. I'll repeat that. So that means 5% of gun stores in this country are responsible for 90% of the guns that are involved in criminal activity in this country. What that tells us is that there are what they call straw purchases. In other words, people that are buying multiple guns for the purpose of trafficking and selling them illegally, knowingly. And again, in many cases, the enforcement in those areas is not, there isn't enough enforcement, unfortunately. So how guns get to a place, how they're proliferated in your community is really important. The other part that's really important that communities don't forget is what's the cost to a community in terms of trauma when people get shot, when people get killed, or people take their life, and what's the impact in terms of the economic impact on let's say housing, the economic impact on businesses, but also the economic impact on, let's say, we work with some communities, Delano, in Santa Barbara, and San Diego, some of these places, some of these cities, Long Beach, right now we're working with Long Beach as well. And one of the things we ask them is, how expensive is it to have a homicide in your community? When you look at just a couple of factors. One factor is, how expensive is it for you to investigate law enforcement after somebody gets killed? How expensive, how much are we spending on just the investigation part? And the average that we've been getting on that part, it ranges between $50,000 and $150,000 for an investigation. And again, this is some of the data we see from some of the cities, from law enforcement. It's been requested by city councils or others, but it's a range just to investigate. In some of these communities, in most communities, only like a third of these incidences get solved. So that means that we're spending a considerable amount of money on investigating a homicide after somebody gets killed, and most of the time we're not solving it. In addition, what we ask communities to look at is, how expensive is it in terms of hospitalization cost, in terms of trauma to the community. And then the other big one is, in those cases where you do have resolution, you do identify somebody who's responsible for a homicide, what does it cost to prosecute someone? I live near Santa Barbara County. We work here, and last year was the end of a very high-profile shooting that occurred, where three individuals killed three young men killed three young men. The estimated cost of prosecuting that particular case, it lasted about 5 years. And it involved multiple defense attorneys, multiple prosecutors. There were public defenders. We're estimating it was between $10 and $15 million to prosecute these three young men. Yet, the county of Santa Barbara spends very little on the prevention of gun violence in communities. And if we had spent a fraction of that amount that we spent to prosecute, I think that we could have saved considerable funds, but also considerable trauma and pain to the community and loss of life. So I think that looking at the cost of the impact that it's having on communities in terms of financial, but also in terms of trauma, is a really important part of it. And the last piece, in terms of, when we're looking at a framework that addresses the issue, is we really need to talk about trauma and healing for people. Young people engaged in violent activity, and or people who survive violence or who lose loved ones to violence, there needs to be a lot of services and a lot of work that's done with them. In my experience, I did a lot of work in gang intervention work. In my experience, the hardest part of this work that people don't talk about in gun violence reduction work is that we have so normalized the idea that the way that we resolve our own conflict internally or conflict with other people is that the way that you can resolve that is that one of the options is to take your own life or the life of someone else. And that's a big problem, because that is not normal human behavior. But we live in a society where in certain sectors, we have so normalized the loss of life and the taking of life as if that's something that inherently is on the table and it's an option. And the reality of it is we need to curb and we need to address that. And a lot of that has to do with trauma that people carry, and also healing, but also beginning to ensure that we reinforce the fact that we highlight that is not normal. So for us, these areas are really important when you're trying to look at long-term sustainable decreases in gun violence. I want to go back to prevention only because part of our conversation has to do with schools, and part of our conversation clearly as parents, you know, my daughter just graduated last year. She just started her first year in college. But when she was in high school, in the area where I live near San Luis Obispo County. One of the things people don't know about San Luis Obispo County is San Luis Obispo County has one of the highest rates of gun ownership in terms of long rifles and weapons. And the reason that concerns me is because here's some stats that I want to share with you that are very important. And the stat that frightens me as a parent. In 80% of school shootings, the shooter acquired their weapon in the home. And again, in 80% of school shootings, the shooter acquired their weapon in the home, which tells us that they had access and or that weapons were unsecured in those cases. So when you have a county like where I live, where you have high rates of gun ownership, I pray that these parents who own guns have them locked up, have them secured, and the young people don't have access to them. So from a prevention standpoint, even though we are engaged in conversations with schools around shooter drills and other things, one of the things that I advise parents and schools to do is to talk about safe storage and whether or not people have access. And certainly we come from a perspective, I grew up in a home with guns. My father had them for self-defense, and he would say, you know, somebody comes into my home, I have a weapon, I am prepared to use it to protect my house, my home. What he didn't know is that I knew where the gun was, and often I took that gun. Because I was around people that had guns and I was frightened. So I wanted to make sure that I was ready. If somebody else had a gun, I had a gun. And so they were unsecured. They were accessible. There was no gun locks. There was no gun safe. There was nothing. My father to this day probably does not know that I accessed them. The incident for, you know, and that's in terms of access. If at any point in my life I had been depressed or suicidal, chances are, if young people know that this is accessible, and this is the part of the conversation that's difficult because we don't like to think about guns in that way. But the reality of it is that if there is access during times of crisis, if you look at these factors in terms of gun violence are really important. Mental health condition, depression, trauma, an underlying condition that we might have that's not being treated, depression, for example, you add to that alcohol and drugs, add to that a culminating event or a crisis, something bad that happens to us, somebody dies, you lose your job, something horrible happens to you, that in of itself creates a crisis. And now you add to that access to a firearm, and you've just increased the probability of lethality and potential for loss of life for individuals. And so while, certainly I've had this conversation with my family, while the aspect of protecting the family is important, you also don't realize that sometimes, depending on who is in your household, it increases probability and lethality. The incident of accidental use, especially access to children who have access to weapons, also increases that probability. Young people are curious. I assure you that if you think that your kids don't know where your weapons are, if you own weapons, I would urge you to ask them. And I think that you would be surprised. Not only would they know what it's there, but they might be able to describe what it is, which means they may have kind of snuck into those areas that you thought were not accessible. Kids are very curious, and they do understand, and they do see things. They see more than we think. So it's very, very important for us to talk about that. So while we think about school safety and firearms, I think that the data that I shared with you is very important, because part of what increases the safety in schools is reducing access for children to have access to weapons. And the data, again, is telling us that in many of these cases, young people get access to their weapons in their home. Again, not to say that there's not access to weapons in the streets, but certainly in most of the cases, they're far more accessible in the homes where they reside if there are weapons available And the final thing I'll add is, as parents, one of the things that we don't think about, we think about child safety. My kids were small. I'm of Mexican descent. My parents would, for right or wrong, culturally, if I was going to go play at somebody else's house, they would ask a lot of questions about who they were. And sometimes they would say no, because their response was, no los conocemos. We don't know them. We don't know these folks. We don't know their family. Because they were very much about safety. They were very much about understanding who the family was before we would spend the night or go play or do these things. And in reality, part of the extension of that really should be, do they own guns? Are they secured? Are they unsecured? That should be part of the conversation, because I assure you, if you knew that I was a weapon and I own, Cuco owns a lot of guns and they're unsecured, I don't think that you'd want your children playing in my home, just because they would be all over the place. And it's a really important thing to understand. I know it's not easy, but when you have that kind of lethality around, it's like saying, that you have poison around the house and you've told the kids not to touch it and not to drink it and not to play with it, not to do anything with it, as if they're going to do that. And oftentimes you would hope that they do. But more importantly, why would you leave such a dangerous thing around for young people to have access to that? And I think that we forget that weapons are very lethal instruments, and certainly in the hands of children, it is not uncommon to hear of incidences where people have been accidentally shot because they were left accessible. Next slide, please. Anybody, and again, like I said, if anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to stop me as we're going through, or write them on the in the chat. If you want me to slow down, or if you want me to expand a little bit on anything, be more than happy to do that. Give it a second. Okay, hearing nothing. Or you can unmute yourself and just jump into the conversation as well. Great. Well, I'll move on. In terms of our work, I want to review some of these things, because this is part of the work that we do, but also part of the information that I think communities need to be aware of. We've been working. Somebody have a comment? Okay. Some of the work that we're working on, I want to share some of this, but some of this is also very pertinent to the community, because one of the biggest projects that we've been working on right now was with the California Office of Emergency Services, related to gun violence restraining orders. And that's important because in 2016, the state of California passed a resolution, a law that was basically, it's called the GVRO, Gun Violence Restraining Order. What you all commonly hear on the news called red flag laws. And the reason that law came into play was because in 2016, there was a shooting in Isla Vista here in Santa Barbara, and I actually worked in mental health at the time when that occurred. It was an incident where a young man who was mentally unstable owned guns, and the mother was very concerned, and she called law enforcement, and she also called mental health, and they attempted to assess this young person because he owned guns and the mother was concerned. There was no legal remedy. The person could not be put on what they call a 5150, which is a psychiatric hold, because he was fine or didn't meet the criteria for a hold. And then law enforcement came in, and legally they couldn't remove the weapon. Later that week or that night, he went and killed multiple people in Isla Vista at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And as a result, the gun violence restraining order came to be. And what that does is it is actually intended for family members, doctors, educators, employers, and law enforcement can institute. This is not a criminal order. This is a civil order. So in the case the example that I gave you, the mother could have said, I'm concerned. I'd like to institute a gun violence restraining order so that my the gun can be removed. He doesn't have access. In this particular case, she was concerned that he would harm someone else, but a gun violence restraining order also is important in those events where you're concerned about somebody's safety. You know, I have relatives in my family who are veterans, who own multiple guns and also struggle with the impact of war and PTSD. And in many of those cases, if I were to see the decompensation of folks in terms of depression or their PTSD, I would want to institute a restraining order to have, or at least make sure they don't have access to weapons. And again, I know it's not for everybody, but it's important for everybody to be aware that that is accessible, because again, in many cases, depending on where people are in their life and in terms of crisis and in terms of mental health and well-being, you may want to utilize this. And part of the reason I'm sharing this is that since 2016, some of the research that we've conducted and other partners have conducted is that very few individuals are aware that this is even in place. I think only 25% of the population was even aware that a gun violence restraining order was accessible and available to people. So I think that that's an important resource that folks can consider and utilize, and again, connecting with some of your partner agencies as well to help you with that. The other area that we work on is emergency violence response plans for counties. Every county has emergency operations plans for environmental disasters. And I think that counties need to accept the reality that mass shootings are something that unfortunately exist in our communities. And we need to be prepared for that in the forms of response, but also in the forms of resources and access for communities that are impacted by that. I can tell you that in Santa Barbara, in the shooting in Isla Vista, when that occurred, none of the partners, none of the agencies were prepared for that, because I think everybody was in denial that these things are even possible. And as a result, what happened is it was just a myriad of there was no planning. Everybody just was trying to address the issue. Since then, my hope is that counties are prepared and cities are prepared to at least coordinate services and response to this, but also to really begin to address the issue of prevention. Mass shootings are not isolated. They are also related to day-to-day gun violence that exists in communities. And again, worst case scenario as parents that we think about is school shootings, but there's other forms that we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years as well. And so that's an important part of it. And I share that with communities and with parents, because that's part of what we need to be inquiring about, enforcing our elected officials and systems to begin to create some type of planning and support for that, to reduce the incidence of gun violence in our communities. The other parts, and Saul will jump into those after this slide, but we also are looking at collection of data. And that's important because, unlike any other area, I mean, I think that I've given you some information and some data, but some of the hardest data to find in the state of California and all over the country is information on gun violence, how people are dying, when people are dying, where the guns came from, who owned the gun, were there drugs involved, were there not drugs involved, was it an incident of domestic violence? Like, all of the details that I think are important for us to address and begin to solve some of these issues are not available, and they're sporadically available. Some counties report, other counties do not. So that's not very helpful. So what we have been trying to do is develop strategies so that we can collect data to make it available to communities. And what we'll share with you is one of the maps that we're looking at, that we've been looking at, because it was very important when you look at this map to highlight that while we think that gun violence is in other places, it is prevalent all over the state of California. And it doesn't matter if if you live in Los Angeles proper, in Inglewood, South Central, wherever, Oakland, San Diego. it is also, you know, and you view those are the places where it's happening. It actually is happening more than 50-60% of gun deaths and homicides are occurring in rural communities through the Central Valley, in small cities, small communities. And they're not, the numbers are not super high, but for the size of the population, it's super high. The average death rate in the state of California is 4 per 100,000. So that means that 4 people per every 100,000. That's the average death rate in California. But when you look at some of these communities that are small, like Lompoc or Delano or other places that you look at, size of, let's say, 45,000 people, their homicide rate might be 10 per 100,000. That's really high. So therefore, we wanted to create this map and this data really to highlight the fact that in many of these places, the impact of gun violence is not just in isolated areas that we think of. And the vast majority of them are actually occurring in these smaller communities where the incidence is really high. Excuse me. So I think that that's important, and you should be seeing that within the map. The other part of it is that we also are trying to collect data that highlights issues of equity. If you were not aware, as of 2018, 2019, the leading cause of death for people ages 1 to 19 years of age is gun violence. It's not automobiles act. It's not anything else. It's gun violence. That's the leading cause of death if you're between the ages of 1 and 19. Now, if you're African American and if you're Latino, those rates are even higher. So this is really an important issue, should be an important issue for all communities. When, you know, the likelihood of death, if you're a young person between 119, you know, it used to be a car accidents, right? It used to be auto related, but that's not the case. Now it's gun violence. It has been, you know, for the last several years, and continues to spike up in the forms of homicides. But now also we are beginning to see an increase in suicide rates with gun violence. So it's a very important issue that we need to talk about. We also need to talk about how it's affecting Latino and African American populations and Native communities as well, disproportionately. The last areas that we talk about is access to resources, and we'll give you some access to that because I think it's important, especially for other communities that speak Spanish and other languages. We're trying to do our best to try to create some of those materials to help folks who want that information, because it's very important, particularly around safe storage, around storing. If you're going to have weapons, making sure that they're safely stored, that your kids don't have access to them, how to be proactive in schools, all of these different things that we can look at. Next slide, please. Somebody says, Maria Costa says to everybody, my father also had, in Spanish, says, my father also had guns at home that I had access to, but I was never kind of prone to use them, right? Unfortunately, I was in the same boat, and I was prone to use them. But such is the point, I think, in many communities. Talked a little bit about Delano and some of the work in Santa Barbara. Part of our approach also is similar to what we're doing here today, is that the community that's impacted by gun violence needs to be part of the conversation. But our approach is to increase knowledge, just like we're doing now. We're talking about, you know, kind of some of the factors that contribute to gun violence, but also presenting a lot of the work that folks are doing in different communities around decreasing gun violence, either gang violence or suicides, or other intimate partner violence, different types of strategies to address it, because there's a lot of folks that are doing that work across the country. And it's important for communities to be aware of that, so that when you engage as a community member in creating some solutions, that you have a lot more information. And it's not simply, we need to stop gun violence. And yes, that's important, but we also want to make sure that family members and community members understand that there's a lot of other folks that are doing this work, and there's models that we can utilize to help us decrease gun violence. Next. Again, we talked a little bit about the gun violence restraining order. So maybe you can move on to the next one. So here's the map. I will turn it over to Saul. Keep in mind that this map that you're seeing here, all those orange dots represent, there's numbers on there. Like you can see one that says 637. That means in that particular county, those are how many people died of gun homicides in the last 9 years. So in the last 9 years, from 2014 to 2022, we have lost almost 13,000 people to homicides, which compared to other rates in the country is fairly low. But that's still a lot of people. We're losing about 1,500 to 1,800 people a year to homicides related to gun violence. So keep that in mind. And the statistics tell us that for every life lost to a homicide and gun violence, you have an equal number of people that die by gun violence in the form of suicide. So 13,000 people that have died in California from 2014 to 2022 due to gun violence in terms of homicides. You can most likely guess that it was another 13,000 people that have died due to gun violence in the form of suicide as well. So this only represents one number. So in reality, in the last 9 years, we have lost approximately 26,000 people due to gun violence in the form of suicides and homicides. Saul?
Yes, thank you, Cuco. And the number that Cuco reflects, that's just in California. And, some of our data and stats tell us that every 3 hours, somebody in California dies to gun violence. We set out to do this map, this geographic information system map, to be able to, one, inform ourselves and where our strategies in the state needed to be, but also inform our philanthropic partners of where investments needed to be. At the end of the day, we are a philanthropic organization wanting to create the proper investments in community. Once we did the mapping and we were able to populate the map and find out where homicides are taking place, as Kuko mentioned earlier, 2/3 of those homicides happened outside of city or urban areas. And so sometimes people think, it's because I live in this community, I'm safer or I'm not safer. But the reality is it doesn't, unfortunately, that doesn't matter. There is, as you can see throughout the map, throughout California, and in the links that Lisa shared, which you could go into down to the street level of where homicides have taken place. We wanted to see that because we wanted, there's the narratives that large urban areas are where gun homicide happens. And once we begin to see the actual numbers of where they are on the map, we realized that's not the case. That wasn't the fact. And so it's put us on this trajectory to really map, research, and know where homicides are happening. Like Hugo was sharing, which ones of those are suicides and which ones are intimate partner violence, for us to be able to understand what are the trends, but also to be able to say, how do we prevent this? What prevention and what tools do we need as a state and as a community? And how do we inform the decision makers of what is actually happening versus what we believe to happen? Next slide, please. Part of what we also have done is we've created a capacity building training for community-based organizations in Northern California. We have trained 19 organizations on how to do their own maps, their own violence prevention maps, their own gun violence data maps in their communities going forward. And so it's been really good to not only help those organizations support their local communities with data, but also all of us help and understand, like, one, how does the technology work, how we can use it, and how we could use that data to impact or change things in our local communities, whether that's education, inform, or again, address, things that government should be responding to with facts rather than what's happening in the news or in the media, or the complete story versus parts of the stories. And so we wanted to do that, and we were able to do that, as well as funding those organizations that are living day to day in Northern California. And we're looking and exploring ways to be able to do this in Southern California, and invite people in the community doing gun violence prevention work to do this work in California. I did see a number of people's microphones open up, so we will do Q&A in a second. In case you have questions about the map, we could always go back and we could answer questions or comments with that. Next slide, please. Part of what Google mentioned, our work with the California Office of Emergency, we've developed a number of toolkits, and these toolkits have a lot of information in numerous languages, 8 languages on the California Office of Emergency webpage that include English, Spanish, and some other languages, mostly popular languages in California. Because again, these things don't exist, and when they do, they're not available in multiple language. To be able to reach the populations that need to be informed and have this information. Next slide, please. And here are some resources, and I know I'm sure Lisa will add them to the chat. But I think I want to say this is probably our last slide, Puko.
And keep in mind that these resources are in English, but there should be a toggle to do other languages if it's available. And some of this is one of our partners, which is Everytown, who we work with. And we have a great partnership with them. They have a lot of resources, especially around safe storage. How to have conversations with people about safe storage, what that means. Usually, gun locks, again, those types of things, safes, different things that you want to look at, so they're accessible. But yeah, this is our last one. I don't know if I think you said there were some folks that might have some questions that have mics open.
Yeah, I saw some microphones open up. I don't know if people did have questions with the map or the data.
Are there any questions? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to share a statistic with the public, because we have been talking about very heavy gun violence prevention work, and the conversation really is also school safety. And I do want to point out that our data also shows that schools are 3 times safer than homes are when it comes to gun violence, and where youth and young people can become victims of gun violence. So schools actually are a safer place than the home, which tells us a lot that there's a lot of work that we need to do in the home, and a lot of information that needs to happen when that number is 3 times what it is in school. It's actually safer for kids to be in schools than it is in some homes, in some communities. Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay.
Questions? Thank you. ¿Algunas preguntas? Any questions? Anybody? Feel free, or comments. We're here for you. So if not, that's fine. We can hand it over back to Lisa.
Go ahead, Brooke.
Thank you. So I actually volunteer with Moms Demand Action and do a lot of work with Be Smart. So as far as your recommendation, we're working on trying to get some of the Be Smart into different schools in our area. Some have been more accepting of it, some have not. I know principals get very scared about trying to bring in these conversations because they're afraid that, it's going to be a heated debate, even though we know that, Be Smart is actually a very safe conversation that normally does not lead to anything more than parents going, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. So do you have recommendations? It sounds like a lot of, what you were talking about really is educating parents on safe storage. It's all of the Be Smart principles. What are your thoughts about bringing this into the classrooms, or not classrooms per se, but into schools, into coffees with the principals, PTA meetings? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think part of it, for us, what's been helpful, we our focus is gun violence reduction. So that means in its entirety, which means that we have to work with the issue of homicides, and what that looks like. Sometimes it's in community violence, right? So gang violence, other types of violence in communities, around homicides. Intimate partner violence is a big part of it. But then there's the other half of that equation in terms of total, like I said, total gun deaths as a result of suicide. So that implies that the highest rates that we see in terms of suicides in populations are actual gun owners. Because they're the most impacted, either veterans or lifelong gun owners who struggle with mental health issues or other issues that are going on in their lives. So that implies that we have to work with people who feel strongly that nobody should have guns on one side, but then also with people who own guns, because if we're going to affect the issue of gun violence in its totality, and we're talking about suicides, we have to talk to people who own guns, talk about risk factors, talk about gun ownership. So I say that because I think that part of the approach that we take that might be helpful, Brooke, is that this isn't about whether you have them or not. It's about let's really talk about the information, let's talk about the data, and let's talk about the risk factors, because those exist. And then more importantly, I don't think any gun owner would say that I want my guns to be readily accessible to anybody in my home, right? That's not the way that most gun owners operate. It's like saying, my car, the keys are in there, anybody wants to take it, even though I'm going to be responsible, please, not a problem. It's community property. That would never happen because there's some liability there. And more importantly, that's just not appropriate utilization. The other part that we also don't talk about a lot about, there's a lot of research on now that's really important, is the use of, we have done a very good job in this country of really emphasizing that driving while drunk or while under the influence is not acceptable. It's not appropriate. We need to do something similar around guns. If you've been, I don't want to be around people that have been drinking and have access to weapons. I'll tell you that much. And a lot of the data is showing that in many cases, when you see acts of violence or suicide or accidental shootings, it involves alcohol or drugs. And I think that's another aspect of it. So my recommendation would be is that, it's not really about taking a position about ownership or not, but really seeing how many folks who can engage around the conversation really of safety and well-being. And I'll say this much, because I think this is what we do find in the data. Safety and well-being of children, nobody disagrees with. Safety and well-being of individuals in terms of suicide, nobody disagrees with. And that's really, I think, the entry point where we all kind of have something in common and can begin talking about a conversation about that. I don't know if that's helpful, Brooke.
Thank you.
And Brooke, if you all need support, we can always have a follow-up conversation. For us at Hope and Heal, we don't like to go into communities and need anything, but we'll support those that are doing that work. And I think for groups like Moms Demand Action, you all are the ones that know your community, will definitely support in any possible way the work that you're trying to do. But again, like Hugo said, schools are a little bit tricky because of lack of information in that arena. There's still more to be done there. We're also having conversations with the health community, with with hospital-based people and pediatricians and people working with pediatricians to explore what this looks like through there and through mental health systems, and so various systems that are still working to catch up and learn about how to begin these conversations and how to have them with community.
Thank you so much, Cuco and Saul, for all of the information that you shared. I see there is a comment from Veronica as well. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, Veronica says it's impressive. The statistics are impressive. I hope that we, in sometime in the future, we begin to reduce the sales of weapons and continue to talk with our children and focus on values. Thank you. And that's a really good point. Part of the approach, I think, as Saul spoke a little bit about, part of our approach is, I tell people, for people in recovery from alcohol is always available. And for people in recovery, what you work with them on is it's always available, but that doesn't mean you have to buy it. Doesn't mean you have to drink it. And I think that, to me, we don't view violence as an addiction, but I think it is. And I think, for me, part of that conversation about values and how we apply values, and I go back to this, there is a lot of work that we have to do in our own homes around the way that we teach each other and the way that we devalue life, where in some communities, it is so normalized that if you violate or you disrespect me a certain way, the appropriate response is for me to take your life. And we have to get to a place where we are pretty clear that there is no situation where it is acceptable where we take someone's life, on both sides of the situation, right? In other words, as a defense or offense. And I think that that's part of it. And we need to really talk about that, because we're not talking about cases in most of the time when we're talking about taking people's lives in terms of gun violence. Very little of it is related to, it was in self-defense and I killed somebody. Most of it was conflict, either interpersonal conflict, a spouse, women who are on the receiving end of this in high numbers because of conflict that occurs in the home, because a spouse, most of the time a male, felt that the appropriate way to resolve that conflict was to take someone's life. In the case of community violence, young people who feel, Saul disrespected me, and the appropriate response is for me to get my gun and take his life because he said something mean to me. He violated me in the way. And I think that really comes to speaking to young people and people in our communities about that isn't normal behavior. That is very abnormal behavior. That is not, but we need to get to that place. So even though weapons, my view is, even though weapons are available, that doesn't mean I don't own a gun. So I'll share with you, I grew up in a gun owning home. My brothers, everybody owns guns except me. I don't own guns. I don't have the temperament for it. I see the statistics. It's very dangerous to have it in my home. There are times in my lives where I think if I had access to weapons, I would either would have hurt myself or hurt other people, if we're going to be truthful with each other about this. And I think that that's the part that we need to talk about.
Thank you so much for that, Cuco. Cuco and Saul, I have a question. I was wondering if there was anything that you could share to us, or what your thoughts are on the status of gun violence and gun prevention laws and policies in California, and if there's anything that families should be aware of as far as new laws or policies that are coming down.
Yeah, well, to be clear, we don't do policy. We are very familiar with what's going on in the state. I will tell you that in California, we have some of the strongest laws in the country around gun ownership, backgrounds, red flag laws, different things. And despite all of that, we still are losing 1,500 to 2,000 people a year to gun violence in the form of homicides. In its totality, probably like 3,000 people die of guns in the form of suicides and homicides. So what that tells us is that legislative piece, we can do other things, but the real important part and the real important work, as we were discussing earlier, is really what parents can do, what families and communities can do to begin to address this. But I also believe, to your point, it isn't necessarily legislative, but it is very local. This is where communities can really, and families can play a part, is to begin to ask questions about data. Like in my community, I want to know how many people are dying of gun violence. How many people commit suicide with a gun? How many incidents of intimate partner violence and death exist in my community? That data needs to be available. Law enforcement and other entities have that information, and it needs to be very public, because if you have a high incident rate of homicides in your community and you're not aware of it, I'll assure you, if something like that happens to you or near your community or to your family, all of a sudden what will become an issue is, why wasn't I aware of this? Why wasn't I made aware of this? That we lived in such a dangerous place. And to me, that's the real important part. The other aspect of it that's really important, that is somewhat related to legislative work, but also local legislative and policy work that folks can be involved in, is I would want to know if my community had gun violence and the guns were coming from Pasadena and I didn't live in Pasadena, or, for example, anecdotally, we know that in Oakland, there is a significant number of homicides where the guns have been tracked to one particular gun store in Livingston. I'd want to know that. And I want to know why law enforcement is not following up with that store in Livingston that's sending guns to my community, where people in my community, it's making my community dangerous. I want to know why they're exporting guns to my community and who's doing that. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities for us as families and community members to begin to ask these questions and to begin to ask for just information, because I think that part of it, what I'm hoping folks walked away with today, is that there's information that should scare you, not because it didn't exist, it's because we were not aware. And you're like, oh my God, nobody, when we talk about, for example, gun stores that engage in unlawful, or, let's say they get penalties for selling illegal weapons or selling to people who they're not supposed to sell, or other things they get caught with. If I was selling alcohol, I would lose my license immediately. But if I sell firearms, if I traffic guns into your community and I get arrested for that, I do less time than if Saul is on probation and Saul is caught with an illegal gun. Those are the types of information. And when we share that with people, they're like, no, that can't be the case. That's the way it's set up. In this country, I mean, this is the one thing that if you're not aware, you should be aware. In this country, if a gun store or gun manufacturer sells a gun and it's responsible for any shooting that occurs or mass shooting that occurs, I can't even take them to court. It's not even allowed. You know why? Because there's something called placa, which prohibits any individual to hold a manufacturer or a gun store responsible, even if they knowingly sold a gun for that purpose, which they're doing. And so people think, no, that can't be, that's impossible. That is the law. I can't even sue a company. And again, I'm not saying right or wrong, but I also think it's important for us to be informed of these things. When people hear some of the realities around how guns are sold, bought, ownership, these types of things, and in California we have pretty stringent laws, but in other states, I lived in Michigan for a couple of years. Nothing more disturbing than going to like Vons, the equivalent to Vons, and somebody's walking around with an AR-15 on their back. Like that was normal in some places in Michigan. So it varies considerably, but I think sometimes we would be very surprised at what is allowable, what is not allowable. If a company sold a vehicle that said, this vehicle is specifically designed to run over people, they would be held liable. And I can tell you right now that there are gun manufacturers that are selling guns that feed into a lot of the there's like a Proud Boy, like special series, something or other, a 3% rifle. It's targeting this demographic already that is really feeding into violence in communities. And again, even if you wanted to, we could not hold any manufacturer responsible for those things. And I think so the important part for me is to be as aware as possible around things and assumptions that we make around gun ownership that maybe don't exist in communities. The number of guns that are stolen, that are sold and trafficked is so high that sometimes we lose and the fact that people don't report that is also a problem in our communities that we need to strengthen. So in terms of legislation, there are some future legislative updates that folks are doing, but to be honest with you, a lot of those are in the margins. A lot of the big things that have been done in the state have already been done, and there may be some more. Our focus, I think to your point, legislatively, I would love to see things that allow us to ensure that we're screening, especially in mental health, in emergency rooms, in public health settings, to make sure that people, not to take their guns, but to make sure that they have safe storage is part of it. Just like when, you know, when we go to public health settings, I tell people, I remember when my family started to do water conservation and light bulb conservation, we received all of those things in a public health setting. For faucets, you know, to save water, light bulbs, energy efficient light bulbs, all of that we got out of health centers when we would go, you know, to receive healthcare. I would like to see a place where if you went into a public health setting, if you owned a gun, that they gave you a gun lock, say, here you go. Because if you own a gun, it should be locked. Here you go, just for free. Here you go. We're not there yet. I think that those things would really significantly increase safety for communities.
Thank you, Cuco. Thank you for bringing it back to community. I really appreciate that. Wanted to give another opportunity for anybody who had any outstanding questions to ask your questions. Does anybody have any notes, remarks, or questions? I see a hand up. Brooke.
Sorry, I have one more question that just brings back to the Be Smart program, because like I said, that's a lot of the work I do. And we, some of us have been given feedback that Be Smart doesn't necessarily translate well across populations. And I just didn't know what your experience was, if you had any thoughts about that, or if you felt like the messaging, you know, if we're sticking really to looking at data and bringing it back to data and stories and facts, if some of the other details that maybe doesn't translate well across different cultural populations, if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that one, there's an absence of data in different languages, and again, usually it's the challenge that we have on the equity side is that things are created in English and then they're translated, and they don't necessarily mean the same thing sometimes. But the way that I think we overcome some of that personally is if you use the appropriate messengers to help you kind of begin to tune that up a little bit to culturally norm that. You know, we work with some, you know, Moms Demand groups and other groups. And that's one of the things, when you have the right folks that are doing the messaging and are in line with the communities that you're trying to target, you can make those adjustments. I wouldn't say that it's not helpful. I mean, I think there's some things that might not be congruent. You know, I'll speak for, I guess I'm of Mexican descent. For Latino communities, the issue really may not be a Second Amendment issue. If you're a gun-owning family, the issue might be its safety. So therefore, you have to approach it very differently, or the issue might be, you know, and so I'll give you an example. The way that we approach conversations in Spanish-speaking households around gun violence and guns is that there's a very, what's driving it is, I have to protect my family. Exactly, you should protect your family. And now we lean into that a little bit more by saying, and if you brought a gun in and it made your home more dangerous, are you doing your job? No. So how do you have to have it safely stored. So those are the types of adjustments that I think we can make. But I think that the basis of a lot of that is helpful. It's just really going to be in the delivery. And I would say that even if it's not necessarily congruent, doesn't mean it's not helpful. But I also think that having the right messengers, Brooke, it can help us kind of deliver that a little bit differently as well. I don't know. And we're more than happy to partner with you if you want. Saúl?
And I was just going to add, you know, going along with what Cuco shared, last month I was at a conference in Sacramento, and there was elders from the AAPI community, and they were very clear in saying, don't translate the messages for us. You have to include us in the translation. You have to include our community in that translation. Don't do that for us. And so it's very clear. And so it depends, I think, you know, what Cuco was sharing, you know, depends on the community you're talking about and what the expectations and the cultural norms are, and being respectful of that, and you know, not in the content but in the delivery. It's not a one size fit all sometimes. And so bringing those communities closer and asking, you know, what's the appropriate message for that community.
Thank you both so much for those thoughtful responses, and thank you, Brooke, for your engagement and your questions. We are at 6:10, and so I'm gonna pause the questions now. We are gonna share Kuko and Saul's contact information so that if you have any other questions or you'd like to connect with them, you can reach out to them directly. And of course, you can reach out to us if you have any questions from the Children's Partnership as well. But thank you, Kuko and Saul, so much for this conversation, for the data you provided, for the context, and all of the advice that you with us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you. We do have just a few other things that we wanted to share with you. Monique, do you want to run the slide? I think a little bit more. Yeah, we have some reminders and resources before we end. You know, in the conversation that Kuko and Saul had with us, they really talked about access to a variety of things, such as mental health services for our young people and our students in school. And for the majority of people enrolled in Medi-Cal, who are majority Black and Brown children in the state of California, the time to renew their Medi-Cal in order to keep access to those services is coming soon. And so we did want to just make sure that you are aware that if you are enrolled in Medi-Cal or your children are enrolled in Medi-Cal, you do have to renew your Medi-Cal between June of this year and May of next year. And so if you have any questions about that or you'd like more information about Medi-Cal renewal, you can go to our website, which is allinforhealth.org. And there we actually have a list of organizations and community-based organizations that can help you for free with your Medi-Cal renewal. And so just really wanted to plug the importance of that and the importance of being able to keep your coverage for a lot of reasons, but also to be able to access things like mental health services that, you know, is very closely tied to safety in schools and gun violence. Additionally, I'm going to pass it over to Ebony for a moment, where she's going to share some resources on other things that and other issues that encompass school safety. You know, school safety and gun violence is just one aspect of what you know, falls under the umbrella of school safety. There's also school discipline, substance use in school, and so forth. And so, Ebony, I'm going to pass it over to you very quickly. And Monique, if you can go to the next slide.
Thank you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. My name is Ebony Durham. I'm the Community Engagement and Advocacy Associate here at the Children's Partnership. And like Lisa said, we did collect some additional resources that involves safety around children. So what you're looking at here is resources around school discipline and substance use in school. For school discipline, we do have a California School Dashboard, which is a powerful online tool that's designed to help communities across the state with the performance of information for K through 12 schools and for educators, teachers, and parents. We also have a video that I provided here on a second bullet, which is a video that results in the effectiveness of restorative justice and programs and practices in juvenile justice. For substance use in school, there are some free downloadable publications, tip sheets, as well as mobile apps for youth, teens, and young adults on topics such as substance abuse, substance misuse, mental health conditions, coping with disasters, and traumatic events. Next slide, please. Okay, additionally, we have resources around digital safety and bullying. The first three bullets under digital safety are from the California Attorney General's office. It contains a variety of resources for educators around children's cyber safety. Also, in the fourth bullet, there are tips for parents. And so it provides a guide that parents can use for a safer internet and safer uses of smartphones. And then if we're looking at the bullying topic, there are bullying prevention training materials, publications, resources, including community-based organizations for community-based organizations, for educators, parents, and community members to recognize bullying behavior and some approaches on how to respond to bullying behavior. Lastly, we do have a few resources for, you go back, please. Thank you. The last two bullets are for the LGBTQ youth. So LGBTQ youth, all kids deserve a safe and healthy childhood, but LGBTQ plus youth are at greater risk for various types of trauma like bullying, homelessness, suicidal thoughts, etc. So all of these adverse childhoods, they can have a psychological effect and physical effect on these youth. So these two bullets are provides resources like crisis hotlines, data, and steps to protect these youth on bullying and other aspects that they go through. Next slide. And I'll pass it over back to Lisa. All of these resources, including the ones from Hope and Heal Fund, will be available to you all after the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ebony. I also dropped the link to the slides in the chat, although I will send them out in email. Again, we said we'll send them out by the end of next week. Just very quick reminder, we have 2 webinars left for this Let's Talk series. November 8th is going to be on school mental health, and December 13th, we're going to be talking about immigrant students and families, resources and new laws that are coming around benefits and access for families. I am dropping the link in the chat to the registration for those, just in case you don't already have them. Next slide, please. And then lastly, wanted to also share, this webinar actually came through in our, read basically through our network. It's gun violence prevention and Medicaid, a state of the field. If you're interested in attending this webinar, we've provided information in the slides, and I'm also dropping the link to the registration in the chat. Next slide, please. All right, with that, we come to the end of our webinar today. Thank you so much for sticking through this and being a part of the conversation. Thank you to our presenters for their thoughtful presentation and all of the information that they shared. We really want to learn and get your feedback about today, what other topics you're interested in. If you have any feedback for us regarding the webinar today, I'm dropping a link in the chat right now to the evaluation. Everyone who fills the evaluation form will automatically be submitted to a raffle where 3 random winners will be selected to win $50. And so if you please fill out the evaluation survey. This is a thank you to you for taking the time to be in community with us today. Enter your information, especially your contact information is very important if you're interested in entering the raffle. And then by the end of this week, we should start contacting the 3 winners to get your mailing address so that we can send you your prize. Again, the evaluation is in the chat. I'll give people a minute or 2 before we close up to click on that link and fill out the evaluation now. It might, take you maybe 1 to 2 minutes to fill that out. Next slide, please. And then while you're doing that, I did want to share again, our All In for Health website includes all of our family-friendly resources and information, and also has resources and information and tools for educators and other child health advocates. And that is allinforhealth.org. And here is also, I'm including Refugio Cuco Rodriguez's email address, my email address, and Ebony's email address. And with that, it's 6:20, so it's dinner time. I will let everybody go. But thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you again to Saul and Cuco. Have a good night.
Thank you.